potential solutions and mitigation methods to the rising incidence of gun crime and gang violence as drawn from international and regional best practice. F, examine any matters related to the questions at hand. And G, recommend to the Assembly and those concerned strategies to address the issue. The hearings, we started yesterday and we are here today, and then we will be following on Thursday from 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. and on Friday, 21st July from 10 a.m. to 12 a.m. The members of the committee are Honorable Single Island-wide Member, Mr. Kenneth Hodge, Honorable Member for Valley South, Ms. Deanne Kentish-Rogers, Honorable Single Island-wide Member, Mr. Jose Vanterpool, Honorable Single Island-wide Member, Mr. Kyle Hodge, Honorable Member for Valley North, Mrs. Shelley Rogers-Webster, Special Members of the Committee, Mr. Rudolph Proctor, and Mrs. Hyacinth Bradley, and Clerk to Committees, Ms. Vanisha Proctor. My name is Merrick Richardson. Today, we have with us Ms. Sanders, Acting Superintendent of the prison. I'll allow you to introduce yourself and give some opening remarks.
Sorry. Good morning. My name is Carrie Saunders. I am Acting Superintendent of Prisons. My substantive post is Head of Security. I have been employed to the prison service since 2011. And I must say proudly that I began as a cook in the kitchen and then worked my way to where I'm at now.
So we'll start with the questions now, Ms. Sanders.
Good morning, Ms. Sanders.
Good morning.
So before we get to your role and your experience within the prison, you're a member of our community and you would be able to have a view not only of what goes on the inside, but experience as well what goes on the outside. What are your general views or thoughts as it pertains to gun crime and violence in Anguilla?
Well, first and foremost, I would say it's out of hand. It's really a challenge for the police force and the law enforcement organizations, I would say, at large. I mean, within the prison, approximately 50% of our population has relations with gun violence, gun crimes. I do believe that one of the greatest challenge is lack of evidence and cooperation, lack of cooperation from the wider community.
Just to be sure, that's 50% of the prison population isn't there for crimes to do in connection with firearms.
Approximately 50%, between 48 to 50.
Do you see a connection between what goes on in the community in terms of the general culture and events and what goes on into the prison?
Definitely.
Do you mind describing or telling us a bit about the similarities or what you see?
Sorry. The prison has its own culture. I mean, it's related to the outside culture as well, because we do find that the gang affiliations outside of prison affects what happens inside the prison surroundings. We do have to separate inmates from time to time, because of the culture that they would have initiated on the outside. So we are aware, I'm sure a lot of us within the community is small, so we should be aware of the east and west gang affiliations, and associations should be limited in prison as well.
So yesterday we would have had the chief probation officer here, and Although talking about juvenile, should have mentioned that the gang culture among youth, even though they might have been separated east and west, when they come and they're residents at the Zenada Haven, those conflicts don't tend to be extenuated as much. They tend to break bread, have snacks, and it tends to be no issue with them sharing the space. And if these are the same gangs that they then evolve to become adults in, do you mind giving a contrast? What's it like when they come from the gang culture outside of prison to then inside of prison? Is it ever a case when they end up working together, or what does the gang culture within the prison look like?
I wish I could say that it was the same from the probation perspective, where we could all do things together within the prison. Obviously, it's not. It affects even the rehabilitative department, because in some instances where programs are offered, we now have to separate persons and provide different programs in different settings because of the gang affiliations. So it's not that easy within our establishment. I would say the same as it is on the outside. Most times it's the same within our department. They have to be separated. Even colors sometimes pose a problem, even colors. So certain colors, they would tell you it's a no, we're not wearing these colors because of the gang affiliations. So we do separate them. No two known gang members then are placed on any one unit.
So if I may ask a question, is it just the case that the gang culture continues within the prison once they're in there, but is separate to the gangs on the outside? Or would you say that the gangs on the outside are actively communicating with the gangs on the inside or influencing them in some way?
Well, we know that there is an issue when it comes to contraband, and we know that phones sometimes are being thrown over, and they enter the prison various ways and various methods. So I would say yes, some communications do happen with those that are incarcerated and those that are on the outside, if that answers.
That's definitely helpful. So yesterday, in the context of gun crime and violence, we discussed our borders. And the prison is a much isolated unit, and you'd have just discussed, for example, people throwing things over. What are some of the gaps in security within the prison that you think needs to be addressed or that are being exploited to allow such contraband like phones or whatever else? And please feel free to expand on whatever else is brought in. But how do they go about getting in? What gaps do we need to fill in order to protect that?
Well, some of the gaps I would prefer to expand in a more confidential and private setting, but for now I know that a lack of certain resources pose an issue for us. Resources in terms of manpower and equipment especially, because I mean, if any of you would have visited our prison, you would have known that we don't have certain items. We do not have body scanners. We do not have a setting where persons can be accurately searched when visitors, because all we can do is a pat-down search. We don't know if persons take anything internally or otherwise, so resources would pose an issue, I would say, among others that can be expanded after.
My final question before I turn over to my colleagues for a bit. You mentioned some of the technological stuff, for example, the body scanners, etc. In terms of staffing, could you tell us what your current staffing complement is like and what a full staffing complement to cover all your needs would look like?
Well, at this point, I wouldn't be able to say what the numbers as it relates to full staffing, what would best suit us, but I know currently we have approximately 38 officers, approximately. And this would have mean that our officers are designated to different areas. Sorry. We would have the rehabilitation and development department, and so those officers would be separate from the officers who take on the daily duties as it relates to the regime of the prison.
Just a quick question. What is the total prison population at this time?
42.
Good morning again.
Good morning.
Thanks for your responses so far. Following up from our chairman's question in terms of prison population, our youth definition on Anguilla is 35 and under. You did say we have like 50% of our current population of those 48 there for gun crime. Could you share with us, if you're able now, the youth percentage that are currently imprisoned? 35 and under?
I wouldn't be able to
wouldn't
share
be
with
able
you now, but that can be sent formally.
Could you share with us the youngest prisoner in terms of age?
The youngest prisoner is 17, so we do have one young offender in our custody at the moment.
All right, thank you. You would have spoken about the gang affiliations, and how it shows itself in prison. I know one of your units deals with rehabilitation. What are some of the programs do you have in the prison to support the reintegration of the inmates back into the community?
Well, we have a number of programs. We have approximately 10 programs that are offered to prisoners. I will just list a few. We have Supporting My Success, Beyond Anger, From the Inside Out. We have the Job Preparation Program. We have the Restorative Justice Program. We have Domestic Abuse Perpetrator Programs, Abused Boys, Wounded Men. We have quite a number of programs.
Okay. Some of these programs sound, I guess, they were very targeted in terms of more personal development for reintegration. But we continue to be aware of the gang affiliations and how it's visible in the prison. What sort of programs are there to help build and enhance team building and camaraderie among the inmates?
Well, I think some of these programs would speak to that as well. For example, the Clean Living. I do believe that we as a department do our best to assist these prisoners for their release period, and we would try to see it depends on the crimes that are committed, then we would identify the suitable candidates to participate. In terms of being more in-depth as it relates to the programs, that can be sent at a later date.
I know you speak highly of the basketball program. That sporting program is still ongoing?
Next week we'll have our internal basketball tournament. We had break for a while, but we have decided to resume, and it starts next week, Monday.
Okay, great, thank you.
And we do offer other things like Father's Day. We do give persons the opportunity to interact with children, family members, and do little activities as well.
Okay, great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, good morning, Ms. Sanders.
Good morning.
Question. Would you say that there is a lack of trust between inmates and prison officers? And if so, what type of attempts or programs are in place to kind of bridge that gap where trust does not exist?
Well, we have had over the years issues when it comes to trust among prisoners and prison officers, staff on a whole. The best way to explain it is that sometimes we are considered the bad guy. They view us as the police, the court. So even if the court makes a decision who is sentenced to prison, who is remanded to prison, and who becomes convicted, and then they see us as a part of the court system, which we are a part of the legal justice system. So, of course, there will be some trust issues, and it causes barriers between us because sometimes we are not able to effectively carry out tasks because of those trust issues. But we have the Visiting Justice Committee who acts on the behalf of the inmates, and the inmates are able to speak to this committee by request, and so I do believe that that is helpful in regards to breaking that or mending that gap.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Just to introduce myself, my name is Deanne Kentish Rogers. I do have a question in relation to what you just relayed in relation to the lack of trust, simply being a part of the criminal justice system. Would you say that any of that lack of trust is fueled by the music that the inmates listen to, which fuels a divide between, let's just say, members of a gang and the police? Are you classed within that category of persons as well? Do you think that the inmates class you within that category of persons when they listen to that music?
I mean, I don't think I want to say a definite yes, but there is a possibility because we know that the inmates do tend to listen to certain genre of music from time to time. I mean, we're not finding a lot of inmates listening to gospel. So, yes, it possibly can affect and cause a challenge, yes. I wouldn't say yes as a definite no in our capacity, but it could pose a challenge.
I just want to go back to the basketball games that you have coming up. Sometime back, I had the pleasure of actually refereeing and actually playing against the inmates sometime back. But in the current culture, now how you were speaking earlier, where inmates have to be separated because of their location and their gang affiliation, how will this affect the games? Because you're going to need them to be in the same space, in the same area, all at the same time.
And that, let me just say that it does. It does affect programs of that nature, because what you find is that some persons can be around some persons, like I said before. So then we'll have to draft a list, and then sometimes it takes 3 different persons to really make a decision who will play and who will not play because of these gang affiliations. But we need to be mindful, though, that for some reason, when it comes to certain activities within the prison, prisoners they choose what they want to come together and work collaboratively in. So believe you me, if they want to work together at the basketball tournament, they may very well even sign something to say, listen, I'm cool with this person, we good, we can play basketball.
Ms. Sanders, do you often see repeat offenders for gun crime, and do you have a statistic on that?
We have had repeat offenders, yes. In terms of statistics, I'm not able to say at this moment. That can be formally sent later.
Just a question, Ms. Sanders. What is the youngest person? Well, this is also 17. Oh, thank you. Sorry.
That's fine.
You would have mentioned that we have 42 inmates at the moment. How many inmates was the prison designed to hold? What was maximum capacity?
I think it's 114. I do believe it's about 114.
So space of prisoners is not an issue at the moment then?
No, space isn't an issue. It's the affiliations with gang that's an issue. Because currently, in other prisons, you would have separation among inmates. Like you would have a wing for remand prisoners. You would have a separate wing for different categories. A category A prisoner would stay separate from a category B or D prisoner. In our prison, that's not the case. Everybody is mixed.
Thanks again. Another question to you, Ms. Saunders. Continuing on the discussion in terms of rehabilitation, integration, camaraderie building within the prison, we're aware that we have sentenced prisoners and prisoners on remand. And not every opportunity is given to those on remand in terms of programming. Why is that so? And is it a resource constraint or is it a practice?
To adequately answer that question, I would prefer to send forth something formally, but I can say most of the times what we've seen is that persons on remand, if they begin a program and then they're released 2 weeks into the program, it's like wasting a resource for us, basically, because they are no longer able to continue with the program. And then we'll have to start over to add someone else to that particular group. But I do think there are some other reasons, and I will share later.
All right, thank you.
Ms. Sanders, there's something here that concerns me, and before I get to my question, I would like to ask. You mentioned earlier that there were no scanners, body scanners in the prison. They are handheld?
Handheld.
You have handheld?
We have small handheld.
Small handheld, okay.
But in terms of scanners, I'm speaking like a walkthrough.
A walkthrough?
Yes.
Okay. In terms of the 50% population is in the prison for gun crime, and I don't know how many of those are remand prisoners and how many are prisoners that have been sentenced. In terms of them coming out of the prison environment, say to do work, public, how is that handled? What is the security measures that are put in place to deal with those prisoners coming outside of the prison environment, especially those that are on gun crime?
When you say coming out of the prison, are you speaking on release or coming out for work?
No, coming out for work and going back to prison.
Okay,
yeah.
Understood. Thank you. We have a specific category of prisoners who would go out into the public to work, and that would be the lowest category, a category D prisoner, who can literally be held in open accommodation, unsupervised at some point. So those persons are really the ones considered to carry out those tasks for outside work duties. And what we do, those prisoners would be considered trustees. So we do identify those prisoners in relation to, and there are a number of factors to consider when we do categorization for our inmates as well.
The other question I have here, this is keep forgetting this. You mentioned earlier that the gang culture on the outside of the prison influences the culture on the inside of the prison. Mm-hmm. As it relates to the prison staff, how are they dealing with that aspect of it? The cultures, the different gangs, whereby in prison you have to separate these people on the inside. What are the concerns that officers are raising with regards to dealing with the gang violence on the inside of the prison?
Well, they are concerned for their own safety as well, because the prison is it's an establishment where anything can spiral at any moment. You don't know. It's like you go in today and you expect the best. You hope for the best. So they would be concerned about their safety in some areas. But I do feel like our officers then are handling it in the best way they could.
Additionally, when prisoners are released for prison or up for release from prison, I would guess that you have exit interviews and exit reports are prepared to inform policy changes, safety issues inside the prison. Are these done? Exit interviews of prisoners who have completed their sentences?
Well, in terms of exit interviews, I know that the parole board would have a meeting and they would speak to various members within the department and probation. In terms of exit as it relates to what happens after their release, I do believe that the probation department would be more suitable at answering that aspect of it. When it comes to parole while they are there, the interviews are done by the parole board. Reports are written from various persons within the department, from the head of the department, security department, rehabilitative department. So those would have been the reports, if any, as it relates to exit. And I wouldn't even classify it as exit because a lot of the times those reports help to make a decision, yes, as it relates to who receives parole, receive release, but sometimes what about those who don't?
What I'm speaking to is in terms of the prison, because for a very long time now, based on the category of prisoners that we have in the prison, some for murder, you say 50% of the population is in there for associated with gun crime, that it would be of some effectiveness for the prison itself, not the parole board, which is a committee outside of the prison, that you would know, gather some sort of information through these interviews from these prisoners who are leaving as to the gang culture in the prison and things that you ought to be concerned with, or whether or not there are prison officers in there who are closely knitted to one side or the other?
No, currently we don't do that.
You don't do that?
No.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Can I quickly ask, is there like a progress tracker to look at the entire sentence of an inmate as it relates to maybe recording different stages of progress that you compile over their tenure that you can perhaps maybe share, not publicly, but in instances where the inmate is trying to seek a job, where you can then share it with that prospective employer?
Yes, definitely. Each sentenced inmate is assigned a sentence planning officer, and then that officer would work along with the inmate in preparing their way forward, basically. So what programs they would engage, what activities, what requirements they may need to fulfill, and all of that. So yes.
I just have a question from something you mentioned earlier about illegal phones and other illegal contraband. Let's say we have to do it by a week-by-week basis. On a weekly basis, how many incidents of this illegal contraband entering the prison you would have? And if possible, you can give us a breakdown of the type of things that come in, or whether it's drugs, phones, weapons, what have you.
On average, at least once per week, on average. Usually phones and drugs are the contrabands.
Specifically, could you state what drugs?
Tobacco, marijuana.
And it's usually discovered by the prison staff through searches or through search?
Searches. We've had a few cases where inmates actually handed over some contrabands as well. But, so yes, we do have good inmates in our custody. But yes, searches, patrols, and we have monthly searches, we have targeted searches too.
Just based on what you've been sharing thus far about the activity within the prison reflecting a lot of what the gang culture is on the outside. To what extent do you believe that the ex-inmates who've been released back into the community feel safe to go back into those communities? Have they expressed to you any reservation about reintegrating in those communities? Or do they feel safer within the confines of the prison?
Well, speaking from my capacity, and please bear in mind I'm only acting, so I may not have full knowledge to some of the questions asked. But from my knowledge, I haven't had any occurrence where someone would have shared their fear or concern about re-entering. I know that the public themselves, the wider public, not the inmate, the public has shared concerns in the past. Depending on the nature of the crime, then they would have shared their concerns.
And in terms of what you said just now, is there any other source that you could point us to get that, maybe that information? Because that would be the practice within the institution that you find maybe some inmates sharing that. Do you think you can get other superintendents, or you can kind of get some anecdotal information for us about whether or not there have been instances where prisoners have inmates who have left had some concerns about reintegrating into their communities?
Well, I could try.
Okay,
I think the inmates usually have closer connection with their probation officers, so some things are shared more with the probation officer, especially those who are eligible for parole. Yeah.
Ms. Sanders,
Yes, sir.
from where you sit in HM prison, and the inmates that you see come in and go through the prison system, would you say they are coming from, there are different gangs, they are related to two gangs on the outside without any names, but based on colors that they refer to in the prison?
Well, from my knowledge, it would be particularly two, and that is East and West.
Yes.
You're welcome.
Sorry, I just want to back up a bit. When you were speaking about the lack of resources and saying that, and you did say that you have a complement of 38 officers. That was correct. Is there an active employment recruitment drive to gather more officers that you know of?
Active? No, not active. We're basically trying to see how best we can. I mean, we know how the budget is. So in terms of finances, I believe that's the greatest challenge as it comes to finding persons or supplying persons for the job.
How much of a strain does it put on officers that you're short-staffed? Does it call for double shifts, person not getting days off? How much of a strain is it on the officers? Because I'm assuming in a job like this, you would want your officers to be as alert as possible.
Yeah. Listening to that question, I know the wider public is listening too, and I wish to use this opportunity to say thanks to the officers who actually are holding the fort right now, because it's very strenuous on our path, and it has caused some officers have even gotten sick because they have worked so many hours, and some persons, yes, do not get the days off that they are entitled to in a particular week. And so that is why we have persons doing double. I have situation where one officer actually did a triple shift recently. And even though we basically said to him, listen, it's okay, we'll hold the strain and you could go, he was willing, and it speaks to his pride and dignity in his job. And I just want to say thanks to the officers through this forum.
In terms, Ms. Sanders, of your officers and their personal security in and out of the prison, have you had any reports of prison officers being threatened in any way in relation to them job?
Oh my God, that's a question. That even the highest office has been threatened.
Wow.
So that's definitely a challenge for us.
Okay, so the committee's focus is on gun crime and violence. Would you say that there's a need for perhaps targeted programs for offenders, inmates charged for gun-related crime?
There should be, with the population having approximately 50% of our inmates being gun-related matters, then definitely.
Ms. Sanders, coming out of this exercise, we're going to produce a report with recommendations, and it is our hope that the recommendations will materially do something to help alleviate the issue that we're facing. What recommendations would you give us, or would you like to see enacted to help fix this problem, whether it's in the prison or in the community?
Oh my. From the prison's perspective, I would prefer to send that in a more formal, yes. I would definitely prefer to.
And that's completely okay.
Yes.
For the general community, if you feel free to
For the general
comment.
community, I mean, I know there are challenges because even myself sitting here face challenges, but cooperation is very important. Cooperation is important, and sometimes it does save lives. So basically, from a wider, definitely, please, let us cooperate.
Ms. Sanders, as a committee, we have spoken to youngsters and the black youngsters in the various communities, and they have expressed a lot of fear. There's fear amongst their peers, they have fear within themselves, and that is the reason why they would normally turn to arm themselves illegally. Do you sense fear within the system, the prison system, amongst the inmates?
I do. And some inmates may not directly speak about the fear they have, but their actions can tell. Definitely.
Ms. Sanders, you spoke a little while ago about cooperation from the community. Could you elaborate a bit more in terms of?
Well, like I said earlier, I do think the police officers do have a challenge on hand, and sometimes it's because of lack of evidence, and lack of evidence sometimes is due to lack of cooperation from the public. I mean, I'm not here to promote the RAPF, so to speak, but I know they have ways and means. You can confidentially report certain things, and I do believe that sometimes that can be used.
So, sorry, Ms. Saunders, just a question related to going back to a lot of the rehabilitation efforts that you spoke about. In relation to those who are leaving the prison, is there with your I don't know if it's with your sentence planning person, who is really responsible for kind of stepping them through the next days out of the prison? If they don't have if they're not on probation and they're just being released back into the community, what does that look like in terms of employment or opportunities?
Well, sorry, the rehabilitation department usually works closely with those inmates leading up to their release. In terms of employment, there's nothing formally structured at the moment. But I know from the past, we've had maybe 2 cases where our department have contacted individuals inside the public and asked them to assist in this area.
How many persons are in your rehab department?
Maybe about 5 civilian staff and uniformed officers as well.
Just a quick question. There are 42 inmates, all male?
Yes.
All male.
Currently, we have no female inmates, which is good, correct? Okay.
Just a hypothetical question, because I'm sure there have been cases where there have been female inmates before.
There have been.
Seeing that the prison is kind of divided based on different factions and who can't associate with who, how is this impacted when you, or if a female inmate were to be added to the population?
But we currently have 2 prisons. We have the yes, 2 prisons. So we have one on the western end of the main prison, and we would normally house the females there.
So is it the case that no one is in that western wing right now?
No.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Excuse me, Ms. Saunders, if you have already responded to that question. You did indicate that you're short-staffed. What's your full staffing requirement?
In terms of on a daily basis?
Yes.
Well, usually we try to have a senior officer, that is, who is responsible for the entire shift and the prison, and that would be a senior officer plus 3 or 4, at least 3. What happens is that from time to time, we don't have the full complement due to sick leaves and sick absence and training and stuff like that.
So what would it look like, a full complement of
Our full
staff?
complement would be a senior officer and 4.
So now that if you are to have female prisoners, then you will have to deplete from that.
Definitely, because a female officer would have to be
yes.
sent to that female prison to supervise the female.
All right, thanks.
The final question that I would have, I already know you can't answer, so I'll just ask that you include it when you send the recommendations for the prison. And that's dealing with the inmates and seeing that half the prison population isn't there for gun crime and related violence. Maybe you might hear things, I'm not going to say you did, but if you do, maybe you might be able to help us figure out a bit more about how these guns are actually getting in. And I'm not saying you do know, but if you do, it would be appreciated.
Noted.
Thank you.
Last question for me in terms of mental health and well-being. That's high up our ladder. We oftentimes ask for support from you now that you're being questioned to assist us in curbing that gun and crime violence. What sort of support do you have as inmates in terms of mental health, psychosocial support as officers? I know the inmates do have, but what about officers also?
Can I just sigh? Listen, this is so serious. This is a serious question, and we don't have the support, and we really should have. It's a stressful job, and we face a lot of challenges, and we really need to have some form of support. And if I may be quite frank, just yesterday, I asked a police officer, I say, what do you do? What do you guys do at RAPF when the stress levels rise? Because we have to remember that sometimes even our sick leave or sick reports then, sometimes persons are not physically sick. It's more of a mental. You understand? So, yeah.
I do know that very limited support takes place within the Ministry of Social Development and Education, and only during the pandemic did they have specific support for first responders and persons on the front lines. Your department would not have had access to that service, would they have?
No. I've known of one case where we had to, well, the substantive superintendent would have, I think it was, I can't remember exactly what the incident was, and we asked Dr. Banks to visit us, yes. But in terms of on a regular basis, it would just be on occasion if something should occur, yes, basically.
Ms. Sanders, we truly thank you for joining us today and being so open with your answers. At this time, we'll give you a chance to make your final and closing remarks.
Well, at this point, I do not have much to say. In closing, I will forward all the recommendations and what has been asked and required of me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So much. Yes, Ms. Sanders, we really thank you for this interview with us this morning. To the listening public, this closes off our sessions for today. We will be back here tomorrow at 2 p.m. So looking forward for everyone joining in. Thank you.